thank you so much for having me. So the gory story of Genghis Khan, also known as Don't Mess with the Mongols, was actually born of my attempt to tell a little bit about Asian history to my daughters who are growing up in London. And I always feel that, history is much maligned. I go to schools all across the world, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, and every time I enter, the first thing I ask the children is, put your hands up if you think history is boring. And a sea of hands go up. Probably the only hand that doesn't go up is the hand of the history teacher. So I really wanted to write a book about history, but make it fun and relatable and relevant, because it is. History is so cool, and I really wanted to write a book for children that they could pick up and laugh with and sort of relate to. And that was my attempt with the gory story of Genghis Khan. And also, as with any story, history depends on who is telling it. And I really felt that Genghis Khan's story, we had only heard from the point of view of him being this conqueror who was bloodthirsty and drank horse blood and killed 11% of the world's population. But equally, there is a side to him that a lot of people, well, not a lot, but many people felt that he was the most far-sighted leader that the world had ever seen. He was sort of the first person who united Asia and Europe into one empire for the first time. And the inventions and discoveries of his time shaped the modern world that we live in. Also, this is very little known, but he upheld religious freedoms. He was a big sort of supporter of women's rights. And actually, the women in Europe had far less freedoms than the women in Mongolia at his time. So I wanted to give a sense to children that history does depend on who's telling the story. And also, this world is getting so intolerant. I feel everybody has just their point of view. I wanted, even if my purpose of writing this book is, even if children can think, that people come with different points of view and with different views of the world. And we all don't always have to agree about everything, but we can still be friends. And I think that's the purpose behind writing something like this. So what I find fascinating also about Genghis Khan, and especially when writing for children, I like to introduce a character who's at the age that the children, that the story is targeted for, the same age group. So I wanted to look at Genghis Khan when he was a boy, because I think we're all shaped by what happens to us in our childhood. And actually, Genghis Khan had a very tough childhood. He lost his father at the age of 9. And as you know, Mongolia was just a collection of tribes, and his father was a tribe leader. And when his father died, he was thrown out of the tribe by the other tribe elders, along with his mother and his siblings and his half-siblings. He's 9 years old. He's illiterate. He's really poor. I mean, his mother tried her best to give the best to the family. She would, hunt for food. They even ate rats to survive. And despite all the hardships, somebody else might have said, oh, well, this is just too hard a life and give up. But this child had it in him. He had the determination to overcome all the odds that came his way and to actually become one of the top conquerors in the world. I mean, by the end of his life, Mongolia was actually a country, those warring tribes had been unified. He's called the unifier of Mongolia. Even the countries he looted, I mean, all the money that he got from them, he didn't build palaces and tombs in his name. There are no statues of him, at least not during his lifetime. In fact, he didn't want anyone to know what he looked like. All that money went into building bridges and roads to connect Mongolia with the rest of the world. He made the Silk Road safer once again for trade to happen, because he was a practical, forward-thinking man. He said, if trade happens through these roads, my people will get a percentage of the trade that happens, and they will have money because they're a nomadic tribe. So what I really liked about him was this determination, and I wanted children the world over to pick up this book and say, okay, this guy is our age, and yet, despite all the obstacles, he overcomes them. Let's read a little more about his story. So it draws children in, because if you talk about Napoleon or Hitler when they're older, I don't know. For me, history, it has to be the hook for me, has to be, if you can tell a child that, this is what their childhood was like, and this is where it came from, and this is how it began. I think for me that just draws me in, and that's my inner child speaking. I've refused to grow up. So yeah, this book has cartoons in it, and as you said, you won't really associate cartoons with Genghis Khan, especially. When I wrote it, of course, it's fact and fiction, because the fiction is the imagined dialogues and all of that. And I found it was quite funny by the end of it. And my editor and I were talking, and she said, do you want to give it a go with illustrations? And I said, why not? And we had this amazing illustrator called Tapas Guha. So this book is published by Puffin. And my editor Shohini is just amazing as well. And I was really scared about approaching Tapas because, through Puffin, because it was so crazy. I thought he would judge me and think me completely mad for having written things like that. But luckily, Tapas had this sense of humor as well. So we managed to come out with, these illustrations that I think make a rather gory story. It lifts it, and there's humor, and you're sort of, relating to it on many levels. So for me, that was, it was really brilliant the way it worked out. I think the best compliment I got was, it didn't even feel like history. It was so fun and interesting. And to me, that was, yay, I managed to tell them something about history, but it didn't feel like history to them. Also, when I went to Bhutan recently for a lit fest and to Dubai, etc., there are not very many protagonists who look like Genghis Khan. So it's nice to see especially in Bhutan, they really related to the fact that he looked a little bit like them. And also, I think they were surprised by the fact that, they expected something and they got something else. And it was backed up by research. So it was a lot of, I've spent 6 months at the British Library just researching for this book, and I've looked at many sources. So I wanted to know, of course, what the Mongolians said. So there was a book written in the 12th century after his death called The Secret History of the Mongols. Then I wanted to know what Marco Polo said, because equally he had visited Mongolia. So I wanted to know, what did the Europeans say, even though it was after his time, it was in Kublai Khan's time. I wanted to know what the Chinese said, what the Persians said. I looked at the Babarnama because, of course, and I didn't know this, but there is a direct connect. I knew how, I knew there was a direct connection between Genghis Khan and Babar, but I didn't know exactly how they were related. So I spent so much time in the British Library actually looking for each member of the family, and there's a family tree at the back of the book, and when I got that, I stood up in the British Library and did a little dance because I was so happy to have finally found that, and people gave me strange looks, so I didn't return there for a few days, hoping they would forget who I was. But yes, I think children are just always drawn in by a good story, a good story. I don't want to talk like that about my book, but by something that engages them, and I think thankfully this has. So actually, a lot of teachers have told me that they are already using the book in classrooms. It's a soft way to introduce, a topic that maybe even in geography, to introduce the steppes of Mongolia and actually how geography shapes history. Because one of the main reasons that the Mongolians could win all those battles is because of their horsepower. And the reason they had that horsepower is because they were nomads. They lived on the steppes of Mongolia, and they grew up from the age of 4 or 5. They were just sent out on those horses, and they were so good with their bows and arrows, so good with riding. And the Europeans had no idea when the Mongolians came. It was like a wildfire across the steppe, and they just completely took them by storm. So it's their geography of Mongolia, the steppes, that actually shaped the history and how they conquered 16% of the world. And if you compare that, even if you're studying British Empire, and you compare that the British Empire at its peak had maybe 24% of the Earth's surface, whereas this man, with his troop of horses and his few men, had managed to conquer 16% without tanks and without ships, just with horses. Again, I sometimes speak about the fact that Japan was never conquered by Mongolia because it was an island, and it gives children, more than anything else, I think the job of a teacher or a parent is to provoke a thought in a child. not to spoon feed, but to make them think about the world around them. And if you do it in a fun way, they won't even notice that it's happening, and it's going to remain with them for life. So, for instance, the term kamikaze pilot. Kamikaze is a divine wind. And Kublai Khan, actually, he said, okay, my grandfather Genghis Khan has done so many things, but he hasn't conquered Japan. Let me try. So he built these fleets of ships and he sent them across, but each time they were destroyed by these kamikaze, by the divine winds. And we're talking now, you know, going back so many years, centuries. After that, nobody attacked Japan until World War II. And that's when Emperor Hirohito called his Japanese pilots and said, you guys are my kamikaze, be my divine winds, go and destroy the Allied ships. So you can make the connection even with talking about World War II or empire or just world history, and where does Mongolia fit into the scheme of things? Or show them a world map and say, okay, he conquered everything from Korea, North Korea, South Korea, Russia, China, going across till Austria. And you know how all of us are the product of our history. We haven't just come here out of thin air. I recently did a DNA test that my husband and daughters had given me, and my sort of results came out that I'm 98% from Pakistan, which is undivided India, 1% from Iran, 1% from somewhere in Eastern Europe. And I'm just wondering, I mean, what is my history? So you can use any sort of inlet to get into this discussion. And the thing that raises goosebumps or gives me goosebumps is that my grandmother grew up in a village called Bhera in Pakistan, in undivided India. And when I Googled Bhera, I found that the Mongolians had been there. Genghis Khan had been there, though I haven't. So, you know, there are so many aspects to history on so many levels: world history, your family history, geography. So I guess teachers are using it, parents can use it, and I'm just so happy that so many children around the world have related to the story.